The silence was a presence, a weight that pressed in on Ilara Vance from all sides, heavier than any armor. It was the absolute sterile silence of a tomb, broken only by the whisper-thin hiss of her rebreather and the frantic, muffled thrumming of her own heart. She crouched in the shadow of a crystalline pylon, a structure that grew from the floor like a frozen geyser of black glass, its surface drinking the faint light from the star field visible through the ship's canopy. This was a Vex harvester, a derelict ghost ship drifting in the Oort cloud, a mausoleum of chrome and starlight. For 3 days, Ilara had been its only living occupant, a specter haunting the dead. The air, thin and recycled, carried the metallic tang of ozone and a faint, cloying sweetness she couldn't identify, the ghost of whatever alien atmosphere the ship's last victims had breathed. She held her rifle, a jury-rigged pulse carbine, in a grip that had long since become second nature, its pitted stock a familiar comfort against her cheek. It wasn't the weapon that mattered, though. Tucked into the small of her back, cold against her spine, was the cognitive scythe. It was her key, her weapon, and her poison, a piece of stolen Vex technology that looked like a shard of obsidian fused with twitching, bioluminescent wires. It was the only thing that could slice through their data architecture, the only tool that could give her what she craved more than air, more than life. She was a xeno-archivist. Or she had been. Once. Her job had been to decipher the silent languages of dead civilizations, to piece together the stories left in shattered pottery and fossilized ruins. Now, she hunted the story of one soul, her daughter, Lily, whose last message had been cut short when the colony on Cygnus X1 went dark. The Vex didn't just conquer, they curated. They harvested the consciousness of entire species, storing them in a central nexus, a library of stolen souls, before sterilizing the host planet. The official word from Earth Command was that the harvested were gone, erased. Ilara refused to believe it. An archivist knows that nothing is ever truly erased. It is merely waiting to be found. A flicker of light, a soft blue pulse from a conduit along the far wall, drew her from her thoughts. It was an active data stream, a trickle of maintenance code in an otherwise dead system. This was her chance. Moving with a fluid silence born of terror and practice, she crossed the chasm-like expanse of the observation deck. Her mag boots made no sound on the polished, seamless floor. The ship wasn't built for human ergonomics, corridors twisted at impossible angles, and gravity plating shifted with a logic she couldn't fathom. Every surface was cold, smooth, and utterly alien. She reached the conduit, a vein of living light embedded in the wall. Pulling the cognitive scythe from her belt, its tendrils writhed in proximity to the Vex energy, hungry. She took a steadying breath, the recycled air tasting stale. The scythe was a parasite. To use it, she had to let it bite. She pressed the sharpest point against her temple, ignoring the learned instinct to flinch away. The device didn't need a port. It made one. A searing, white-hot pain lanced through her skull as the scythe's microfilaments bypassed bone and tissue, burrowing directly into her optic nerve and frontal lobe. Her vision exploded into a snowstorm of static, raw data flooding her senses. This was the price of admission. She wasn't hacking the system. She was becoming part of it. The Vex architecture was a cathedral of light and logic, a place of silent, screaming perfection. She saw star charts written in light, equations that described the folding of space-time, the life cycles of species cataloged with the cold detachment of a botanist pressing flowers. She ignored it all, pushing deeper, searching for a single thread in a tapestry the size of a galaxy. Her own memories began to fray at the edges, bleeding into the data stream. She saw Lily on a swing, her laughter a sound that didn't belong in this cold, silent place. The memory was so sharp, so real, it almost made her pull back. But the pain of the memory was also her anchor. Find her. Find the nexus. She pushed the thought into the system. A raw, emotional query that was like a scream in a library. The system recoiled. It hadn't been expecting a ghost in its machine. Alarms, silent and psychic, rippled through the ship's dormant networks. A sliver of information came back. Not an answer, but a pathway. A glimmer of a coordinate buried under layers of quantum encryption. It was the location of the ship's local data spire, a smaller node that would sync with the central nexus when the harvester was active. It was deep within the ship, in the core, and then the ship began to wake up. A low hum vibrated up through the soles of her boots, a resonant frequency that made her teeth ache. The ambient lighting shifted from the dim blue of standby to a stark, analytical white. Ilara ripped the scythe from her head with a strangled cry, dark blood trickling down her temple. The data stream snapped shut, but the damage was done. She was no longer a ghost. She was an infection, and the ship's immune system was kicking in. From panels in the floor, 3 machines unfolded themselves. They were janitors, automated maintenance drones, but their design was inherently hostile. They moved on multiple spindly legs, their chrome bodies unfolding to reveal plasma cutters and containment claws. They weren't weapons, but a cornered mechanic will use a wrench as a club. She didn't hesitate. Her rifle came up, spitting coherent light that blasted the first janitor off its legs. The other 2 scrambled, their movements unnervingly fast, scuttling along the walls and ceiling. She backpedaled, firing, her shots ricocheting off the crystalline pylons. This was a fight she couldn't win. She needed to get to the core. She broke into a desperate sprint, diving through a shimmering doorway that irised open as she approached. The corridor beyond was a nightmare of shifting perspectives. The floor became the ceiling. The walls twisted into a spiral. And for a disorienting moment, she was running upside down. The janitors were undeterred, their mag limbs clinging to the surfaces as they gave chase. The data she'd stolen burned in her mind, a partial map overlaid on her vision. Left here, down, through the cryo bay. The thoughts were a lifeline. She slid down a frictionless ramp, landing hard in a vast, cavernous chamber. The air was frigid, mist coiling around her boots. This was a stasis chamber, and the walls were lined with thousands of pods, each holding a biological sample, a piece of a forgotten world preserved in cryogenic stillness. The sheer scale of it, the silent testament to 1,000 genocides, stole her breath. A shadow detached itself from the far end of the chamber. It was larger than the janitors, its form more refined, almost elegant. It was a warden, a guardian of the Vex's most precious archives. Its chrome chassis was inlaid with glowing filaments, and instead of claws, its arms terminated in blades of pure energy that hissed in the cold air. It didn't scuttle, it glided, its movements silent and deliberate. The data flash from the scythe had given her more than a map. It had given her a sliver of understanding. The Vex were perfect, logical. Their flaw was their reliance on that perfection. They didn't anticipate chaos. The warden raised an arm, and a beam of concussive force slammed into a row of stasis pods beside Elara, shattering them and showering her with frozen vapor and alien viscera. She rolled behind a larger console, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her pulse rifle was useless against the Warden's personal energy shield, but the scythe had shown her a weakness, a harmonic frequency in their shielding that was susceptible to kinetic shock. It was a 1-in-a-million flaw, a rounding error in an otherwise perfect equation. The Warden glided closer, its featureless faceplate tilting as if in curiosity. It saw her not as a threat, but as a contaminant to be sterilized. She waited, controlling her breathing, forcing the cold air into her lungs. The memory of Lily's face was a burning ember in her mind. For her, as the Warden raised its arm for another blast, Elara erupted from behind the console. She didn't fire her rifle. Instead, she sprinted directly at the machine, her mag boots giving her purchase on the slick floor. The Warden paused, its logic processors struggling to categorize this illogical act of aggression. In that microsecond of hesitation, Elara slid, dropping to her knees and slamming the butt of her rifle against a specific point on the floor plating, a junction for the chamber's primary coolant lines. The impact was dull, but it sent a precise kinetic shockwave through the deck. The frequency traveled through the Warden's feet, up its chassis, and into its shield generator. The shimmering energy field around the machine flickered, stuttered, and died with a sound like shattering glass. The Warden's head snapped towards her, a new, more lethal intent in its posture, but Elara was already moving. She brought the rifle up and fired, not at its armored chest, but at the exposed joint where its head met its torso. The plasma bolt struck home, melting the biomechanical musculature. The Warden staggered, its energy blades retracting. It took 2 more steps, then collapsed, its chrome body clattering on the deck with a sound of finality. Elara didn't have time for relief. The entire ship was now groaning around her, a wounded beast stirring from a long slumber. Red alert lights began to pulse along the walls, bathing the chamber of the dead in a bloody glow. Her quiet, desperate infiltration was over. The Harvester was awake, and it knew she was inside. She was wounded, bleeding from the scythe's brutal interface and a dozen minor cuts from the stasis pod explosion, but she had the path. In the storm of data she had stolen, she had seen the way to the ship's data spire, the key to finding the Nexus, and, with it, the soul of her daughter. The ship was no longer a derelict, it was a hunting ground, and she was the prey. But an archivist knows that the most valuable things are always buried the deepest, guarded by the most fearsome dragons. And for the chance to hear her daughter's laughter one more time, Elara Vance would gladly walk into the dragon's maw. The chamber door at the far end hissed shut, sealing her in. Another, closer to her, began to open. She raised her rifle, the pain in her head a dull roar, and faced the darkness, ready for whatever came next. The door slid open not with a hiss, but with the sound of grinding ice, revealing a corridor that pulsed with a soft, predatory bioluminescence. Elara didn't wait for an invitation. She scrambled through the opening, rifle at the ready, her back screaming in protest from her dive across the stasis chamber floor. The moment she cleared the threshold, the door behind her fused shut, the metal glowing cherry red for a heartbeat before cooling back to an indifferent black. There was no going back. The corridor ahead was a long, vaulted passage, lined with the same crystalline pylons as the observation deck, but here they seemed to weep a thin, phosphorescent mist that coiled around her ankles. The air grew thick with the cloying, sweet scent she'd noticed before, now so potent it felt like breathing perfume. She took a cautious step forward, and the ship responded. From the walls, things began to emerge, not with the mechanical unfolding of the janitors, but like oil separating from water. They were vaguely humanoid figures composed of shimmering, unstable light, their forms constantly shifting, their faces blank canvases of static. They were phantoms, and they carried no weapons. They didn't need them. As the first one drifted closer, a sound echoed in Ilara's mind, a sound that had no business being in this cold, dead place, a child's giggle. It was Lily's giggle, the one she made when she was hiding and thought no one could find her. Ilara froze, her finger tightening on the trigger. The phantom's featureless face flickered, and for a terrifying second, it resolved into Lily's smiling face, eyes crinkling at the corners. "Hide and seek, Mommy," the voice whispered, not through the air, but directly into her consciousness. It wasn't a recording, it was a weaponized memory. The Vex weren't just attacking her, they were dissecting her, pulling out the pieces of her soul and showing them to her before they broke them. "You're not real," Ilara snarled, the words a desperate incantation against the rising tide of grief in her chest. She raised her rifle and fired, but the plasma bolt passed straight through the apparition, splashing harmlessly against the far wall. The phantom drifted closer, its projected face now twisted in an expression of theatrical sadness. "You didn't find me," it whispered, Lily's voice now filled with a chilling, artificial sorrow. More phantoms were coalescing from the walls, their forms beginning to flicker with other faces, other stolen moments. Her father, smiling at her university graduation. Her husband, Ben, on the day they met, his laugh echoing in a cafe that had been turned to dust years ago. They were using everything. They were turning her life into a ghost story, and she was the only one being haunted. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. This was a battle she couldn't win with a gun. She was an archivist, a reader of patterns. She forced herself to see, not just to feel. The phantoms weren't truly independent. They were terminals, projections from a central source. Their light, their very existence, was tethered to the pulsing conduits in the walls. They were manifestations of the ship's now active psychic network. The cognitive scythe on her back vibrated, a low, hungry thrum. It wanted to feed. It was a terrible, desperate idea, but it was the only one she had. Ignoring the screaming projections of her past, she lunged for the nearest wall conduit. She drew the scythe, its tendrils lashing out like living things. This time, she didn't hesitate. She jammed the point into her own forearm, gritting her teeth against the fresh wave of agony. The scythe bit deep, its filaments wrapping around nerve and bone, and through that horrific symbiosis, she became a part of the ship's circuitry once more. She didn't try to pull information this time. She pushed. She focused all her pain, all her rage, all her love for the real Lily into a single, chaotic burst of psychic static. She screamed into the network, a raw, unstructured blast of human emotion. The Vex system, built on pure, cold logic, reeled from the illogical assault. The phantoms wavered, their forms dissolving into shrieking blurs of light. The projected faces distorted, melting like wax, their voices becoming a chorus of digital screams. The corridor flickered, and, for a moment, the bioluminescence died, plunging her into absolute darkness. In that darkness, the scythe fed her a single, fleeting image, a branching pathway, a correct turn in a corridor that was about to reconfigure. She ripped the scythe free, her arm a bloody mess, and sprinted. Just as she rounded the corner shown in the vision, a wall of solid chrome slammed down where she had been standing. The ship was learning. It was adapting to her presence, treating her like a virus, rewriting its own architecture to isolate and destroy her. The next hour was a blur of calculated flight and desperate survival. The Harvester was a living labyrinth, a puzzle box that rearranged itself around her. Passages would lead to dead ends. Gravity would reverse without warning, sending her tumbling onto a ceiling that had once been a floor. The only way forward was the scythe. Every few minutes, she would have to endure the agony of the interface, letting the device bite into her flesh to steal a momentary glimpse of the ship's shifting blueprints. Each connection left her weaker, her own memories becoming increasingly frayed, laced with shimmering Vex code. Sometimes, she would forget what she was running from, only to have the memory of Lily's face bring her back with a jolt of renewed purpose. The ship's attacks grew more sophisticated. It learned that the memory projections were a vulnerability and switched tactics. It started creating illusions, not of the past, but of hope. She turned a corner and found herself in a fully stocked Earth Command medbay, a smiling doctor telling her it was all a bad dream. She smashed the holographic projector with the butt of her rifle and ran. She found an escape pod, its inner door open, promising a silent drift back to safety. She saw the telltale shimmer of a hard light field just in time and rerouted. The Vex were logical, yes, but their logic was that of a predator, endlessly patient, endlessly creative in the crafting of its traps. The most dangerous trap was the one she almost fell for. Exhausted, bleeding from half a dozen wounds, she stumbled through an archway and into a place that stopped her cold. It was a perfect recreation of Lily's bedroom on Cygnus X1. The star charts drawn in crayon were tacked to the wall. The mobile of tiny spaceships hung over the bed, and the faint scent of lavender from Lily's favorite soap filled the air. Standing by the window, looking out at a projected image of the Cygnus Nebula, was Lily herself. She turned, not a flickering phantom, but a solid, warm-looking simulation. "I knew you'd come, Mommy," she said, her voice flawless, filled with the unconditional love that Ilara had been starving for. Ilara's rifle sagged in her grip. Her legs felt heavy, her resolve crumbling into dust. Every part of her wanted to walk to the bed, to sit down, to stay in this perfect, painless moment forever. The simulation was a masterpiece, appealing to the deepest, most exhausted part of her soul. This was the Vex's checkmate. They couldn't break her with fear, so they would smother her with love. The Lily simulation took a step towards her, her arms outstretched. "Stay with me. We can be a family again." The word family was the flaw. Ben was gone. He wasn't here. The Vex had shown her his memory. But in this perfect trap, he was conspicuously absent. Their logic had made a critical error. They had recreated a daughter's room, but they hadn't understood the context of the family that filled it. It was an archivist's insight, a tiny crack in the facade. The realization was the cruelest kind of deliverance. This beautiful, perfect illusion was the deadliest cage of all. Tears streamed down Ilara's face, hot against her cold skin. "You are a beautiful lie," she whispered. She raised her rifle. The Lily simulation smile didn't waver. It couldn't comprehend its own destruction. "I love you," Elara sobbed, and pulled the trigger. The room dissolved into a shower of light and code, the plasma bolt vaporizing the central projector hidden beneath the simulated bed. The silence that rushed back in was heavier, more profound than before. She had just murdered the ghost of her own daughter to save her soul. The act nearly broke her, but it also forged her grief into something harder, something diamond sharp. She would not be tricked again. She was no longer just a mother looking for her child. She was an avenger, an antibody in the veins of a sick and monstrous machine. Pressing on, she found the physicality of the ship's defenses intensifying. Automated turrets, previously dormant, now tracked her movements, forcing her to dart between cover. Janitor patrols swept the corridors in systematic, overlapping patterns. She was a scholar, not a soldier, but she learned quickly. She used the ship's logic against it, triggering pressure plates that would seal doors behind her, trapping the drones. She ricocheted shots off the crystalline walls to hit power conduits, creating temporary blackouts that allowed her to slip past sensor grids. She was close now. She could feel it. The hum of the ship was deeper here, resonating in her bones. The very air seemed to vibrate with stored energy. After fighting her way through a final choke point, destroying 2 janitors by overloading a nearby energy capacitor, she came to a precipice. It was the edge of a vast, spherical chamber that formed the core of the harvester. In the center, suspended in a web of crackling energy beams, was the data spire. It was a pillar of solid light, a churning vortex of information that seemed to bend space around it. Crystalline shards, each glowing with captured data, orbited the spire like miniature planets. The air was not air. It was a palpable medium, thick with raw information that made the hair on her arm stand up and the fillings in her teeth ache. This was the ship's brain, its library, its soul. And it was here she would find the first real clue to the Nexus. The chamber was not unguarded. Patrolling the spherical walls were 3 wardens, their energy blades ignited, their movements a synchronized, deadly ballet. Getting to the spire would be suicide, but she didn't have to get to it. The scythe had shown her something else, a final, desperate gambit. The spire had remote access terminals, focusing lenses positioned around the chamber's equator. If she could reach one, she could interface directly. She spotted one 50 meters away, a small console glowing on a narrow catwalk. Getting there would mean crossing open ground, in full view of all 3 guardians. There was no other way. She took a deep breath. The memory of the room she had just destroyed a cold weight in her stomach. She holstered her rifle. She wouldn't be able to fight her way through. She would have to be faster than their targeting systems. Elara broke from cover, sprinting along the curved wall of the chamber. Instantly, the 3 wardens turned, their movements impossibly fast. Concussive blasts began to detonate around her, scorching the chrome walls. The force of the explosions throwing her off balance. She dodged, weaved, her body screaming as she pushed it past every limit. A blast hit the wall beside her, and a razor-sharp shard of metal sliced across her thigh. She cried out but didn't stop. She was a dozen meters away. 10, 5. She launched herself in a desperate dive, her fingers outstretched. Just as a coordinated blast from all 3 wardens converged on her position, she landed hard on the catwalk, her hand slapping against the cool surface of the terminal. The world behind her erupted in a blinding flash of white light and searing heat as the catwalk's support struts were vaporized. The platform buckled, groaning under the strain, threatening to pitch her into the abyss. There was no time. with blood streaming from her leg, her vision blurring from the pain. She slammed the cognitive scythe down onto the terminal's interface. The connection was instantaneous and apocalyptic. If the conduits had been like drinking from a fire hose, this was like being chained to the bottom of a waterfall. The entirety of the Harvester's local data flooded her mind, every stolen memory, every star chart, every schematic, every last thought of every last victim who had died within these walls. It was a universe of silent screams. She saw the Vex's arrival at Cygnus X1. She saw the colony's defenses obliterated. She saw people dissolving into columns of light as their consciousness was harvested. And then, buried in the torrent, she found it. A single data packet, encrypted and flagged for priority transfer. It was a manifest, a list of every consciousness harvested from the colony. And as the ship's core systems overloaded her brain, threatening to shatter her sanity into a million pieces, her eyes, both physical and mental, locked onto a single line of code, a single designation. It was Lily. Her daughter was in the system, and next to her name was a single, terrifying word, archived. But it wasn't a location. It was a status. And as the wardens advanced on her crippled position and the ship's consciousness bore down on her own, a new, more horrifying piece of information surfaced from the data storm. The Nexus wasn't a library. It was a furnace. The universe dissolved into a symphony of agony. The data spire wasn't just a machine. It was a nexus of a billion stolen moments. A chorus of silent, screaming souls. And it was all pouring directly into Ilara's mind. She saw births and deaths, triumphs and betrayals, the fall of empires written in starlight, and the simple, perfect taste of a child's first ice cream. It was too much, a tsunami of existence that threatened to obliterate the shores of her own identity. Her name, her mission. Even Lily's face began to fracture, dissolving into the overwhelming sea of Vex data. The catwalk beneath her shrieked, tearing away from the wall. The wardens advanced, their energy blades carving sizzling arcs through the superheated air. Death was coming from above and below. But in the heart of that data storm, a new kind of clarity emerged, born of absolute despair. The Nexus wasn't a prison from which a soul could be rescued. It was a pyre. The Vex didn't collect consciousness for posterity. They collected it as fuel. They burned souls to power their expansion. An act of such profound, logical evil that it defied all human comprehension. Lily wasn't waiting for her. She was in a queue, a line item on a manifest, slated for incineration. In that moment, Ilara Vance, the archivist, died. What was left was a raw nerve of maternal rage. If she couldn't save her daughter, she would burn the library. She was still connected. The scythe, a conduit of unimaginable power. She couldn't fight the wardens, couldn't stop the fall. But she could still speak to the machine. She focused the entirety of her being, every scrap of pain and memory, into a single, devastating command. It wasn't a complex line of code. It was a primal, gut-wrenching scream given form. Unmake. She pushed the concept into the data spire's core matrix. It was an order so antithetical to the Vex's nature of perfect preservation and control that the system didn't know how to reject it. It tried to process the illogical, and it broke. The web of energy beams holding the spire in place flickered, turned a violent violet, and then snapped. The pillar of pure light, the central repository of 1,000 conquered worlds, collapsed in on itself. The explosion was silent, a wave of pure force and psychic agony that washed over the chamber. The three wardens were instantly vaporized, their chrome bodies sublimating into nothingness. The catwalk disintegrated beneath Ilara, and she fell. For a second, she was weightless, tumbling through a void filled with the dying echoes of 1,000,000,000 souls. Then she hit a service conduit with a bone-jarring impact that knocked the wind from her lungs and sent a fresh spike of fire up her wounded leg. She clung on, her fingers scrabbling for purchase on the smooth, vibrating surface as the chamber imploded around her. The spire's death created a vacuum, sucking everything inward. Shards of crystalline plating, pieces of the chamber wall, the very air itself rushed past her into the newly formed singularity. Her grip slipped. This was it. This was the end. But as the conduit she was on tore free from its moorings, it was flung outward by the blast's secondary shockwave, a piece of shrapnel in a cosmic detonation. It hurled her across the chasm and slammed her into the far wall, just inside a maintenance access tunnel that the explosion had ripped open. She lay there, crumpled and broken in the darkness of the tunnel, as the core of the Vex harvester tore itself apart behind her. The roar was a physical thing, a pressure that squeezed her, and then it was gone, replaced by the groaning protest of a mortally wounded ship. She was alive. The realization came slowly, through a fog of pain. She forced herself to move, to crawl deeper into the tunnel, away from the radiation-bleached precipice. Every movement was a fresh hell. Her leg was a ruin, the metal shard still embedded in her thigh. Her arm, where she'd repeatedly used the scythe, was a mangled mess of blood and burnt tissue. She found a small junction, a space barely large enough to sit up in, and collapsed, her back against the cold metal wall, in the enclosed darkness, with only the frantic beat of her own heart for company. She finally allowed herself to process the truth. Lily was gone, not just taken, not just lost, but sentenced to erasure. The thought was a black hole that threatened to swallow what little of her was left. She unclipped a small, dinted locket from around her neck. Inside was a tiny, flickering hollow image of Lily, captured mid-laugh, a gap in her front teeth and chocolate on her cheek. It was the only thing she had left that the Vex hadn't touched, hadn't weaponized. She stared at it. The tears she thought she no longer had tracing paths through the grime and blood on her face. For a long time, she just sat there, adrift. Hope was dead. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, something else began to stir in the ashes of her grief. It was the archivist, the methodical, patient part of her that looked for patterns, for meaning in the ruins. The Nexus was a furnace. Yes, but a furnace implies a process. There is a before, a during, and an after. The manifest had listed Lily's status as archived, not processed, not pending. Archived. It was a subtle distinction, the kind of detail only a scholar would cling to. What if it meant she was still there? What if her data packet was simply sitting in a buffer, waiting to be fed into the pyre? The hope that bloomed was a small, fragile, and utterly insane thing. But it was enough. She had a new mission. It wasn't a rescue anymore. It was a heist. She had to get to the Nexus and steal her daughter's soul back from the fire. And if she failed, she would still fulfill her other vow. She would become the furnace herself and burn it all to the ground. She needed a plan. And for that, she needed information. The data dump from the spire, though agonizing, had left a residue. Schematics, command hierarchies, system protocols, it was all there, swimming in the back of her mind, a chaotic library waiting to be indexed. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to push past the psychic screams and access the cold, hard data. The harvester was dying, but not dead. Its primary FTL drive was offline. Its power core was in a state of cascading failure, but its auxiliary systems were still fighting for control. Among those systems was the ship's long-range comms array and, more importantly, a small single-occupant scout vessel docked in a secondary launch bay, a whisper craft designed for stealth insertions. That was her way out and her way in. According to the stolen data, all harvesters eventually returned to a central processing hub to offload their cargo of souls. That hub was the Nexus. If she could seize control of this ship, even for a moment, she could force it to plot a course. Or, failing that, she could get to the Whisper, which would have the Nexus's coordinates locked in its navigation system as a default return point. Her path was clear. She had to get from the ship's ruined core to the secondary launch bay, located near the vessel's prow. It was a journey of several kilometers through a ship that was actively tearing itself apart and viewed her as a foreign body to be purged. First, survival. She tore a strip of fabric from her undersuit and used it to crudely bandage her arm. The shard in her leg was a bigger problem. Pulling it out would cause massive bleeding, leaving it in risked infection and further damage. She gritted her teeth and snapped the protruding piece of metal off, leaving the rest embedded deep in the muscle. It was a temporary, brutal solution. She then took stock of her gear. Her rifle was gone, lost in the fall. She had the cognitive scythe her key, and her curse a single plasma cutter with a half-depleted power cell, and the locket. It wasn't much. She began to move, crawling through the maintenance tunnels. This was the ship's circulatory system, a network of passages never meant for passengers. It was dark, cramped, and terrifying. The ship's groans were louder here, the shrieks of stressed metal a constant, unnerving chorus. Occasionally, a section of the tunnel would be flooded with coolant vapor or crackling with raw electricity from a ruptured power conduit, forcing her to find a different route. She was guided by the map in her head, a phantom limb of knowledge from the spire. As she crawled, she saw the ship's defenses adapting. The janitors were gone, likely destroyed in the core breach, but the ship was deploying its microscopic immune system. Nanite swarms, designed for internal repair, were now being repurposed. She saw them ahead in a larger conduit, a shimmering silver cloud that flowed like liquid metal. They were disassembling a damaged bulkhead, molecule by molecule. She knew if she touched that cloud, they would do the same to her. She was forced to backtrack, her journey becoming a deadly game of chess against an opponent who controlled the board. After hours of crawling, she emerged into a silent, cavernous space. It was a cargo bay, vast and empty. The far wall opened to the void where an outer door had been torn away. Stars glittered in the terrifying, beautiful emptiness. And standing in the middle of the bay, silhouetted against the starfield, was a single, waiting warden. It hadn't been destroyed. Perhaps it had been on a different patrol route, drawn here by the ship's distress calls. Its energy blades were not ignited. It just stood there, its head tilted, as if it was listening. Ilara froze. pressing herself into the shadows of the tunnel exit. There was no cover between her and it. No way to fight it. But as she watched, she realized it wasn't looking for her. It was looking at a console near the edge of the ruptured bay door. On the screen, lines of Vex code scrolled rapidly. It was receiving a message, a new set of orders from somewhere outside the ship. The scythe on her back pulsed, a faint, rhythmic beat. It could feel the signal, ignoring every instinct for self-preservation. Ilara knew what she had to do. She had to know what that message said. It was her only advantage. She took the scythe in her hand, the bloodied, mangled state of her arm a testament to her previous uses. This would be the deepest cut yet. She needed to be close. She began to creep along the wall, using the deep shadows cast by the bay's support struts as cover, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The warden remained motionless, absorbed. She was 20 feet away when its head snapped in her direction, its featureless faceplate locking onto her position. It had heard her. The blades on its arms ignited with a sharp hiss, bathing the bay in their lethal blue light. The warden moved with a speed that defied its size, gliding across the deck like a phantom, its energy blades leaving shimmering trails in the thin atmosphere of the cargo bay. Ilara didn't have time to think, only to react. She dove behind a stack of metallic crates, the only cover in the vast open space, just as a concussive blast from the warden's shoulder-mounted emitter slammed into the spot where she'd been. The crates screeched, glowing white-hot from the impact. But they held, peeking through a gap. She saw the warden advancing, methodical and relentless. Her rifle was gone. Her plasma cutter was a tool, not a weapon. All she had was the scythe and the insane, desperate plan it had whispered to her. The warden was receiving a signal, a live data stream. That stream was its connection to the Vex Collective, its source of orders. If she could sever that connection, or better yet, hijack it, she could turn the machine's greatest strength into its most fatal weakness. It was the same principle she'd used against the Phantoms, but on a scale that could shatter her mind. The warden fired again, the blast vaporizing the top half of her cover. She scrambled back, the heat scorching her face. It was hurting her, driving her towards the open maw of the ruptured bay door and the cold, unforgiving vacuum of space. She had to get closer. She needed to be within arm's reach. It was a suicide run, but it was the only run she had. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she clutched the cognitive scythe in her good hand. She broke from cover, not running away from the warden, but directly at it. The maneuver was so unexpected, so completely illogical, that the machine paused for a fraction of a second, its targeting matrix recalibrating. That was all the time she needed. She didn't try to dodge its next swing. She couldn't. Instead, she dropped into a slide, aiming for the space beneath its sweeping energy blade. The heat from the blade passed inches over her head, searing her hair and filling the air with the smell of ozone. As she slid past its legs, she jammed the point of the scythe not into her own body, but into a flexible data conduit running along the back of the warden's ankle. The effect was instantaneous. The scythe, a parasite designed to interface with Vex technology, bit into the machine's data stream. For Ilara, the world exploded into a maelstrom of pure, weaponized logic. She was inside the warden's mind. She saw herself through its multifaceted sensors, a target designated contaminant hostile. She felt the cold, passionless imperative to sterilize, to purge. But she was not just a passenger. She was a virus. She pushed back, using the scythe as a bridge, pouring her own chaotic, emotional consciousness into the machine's pristine processing core. The warden staggered, its movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated. Its energy blades flickered. On its internal command display, contradictory orders flashed in a chaotic stream. Eradicate, protect, query, attack, stand down. The signal it had been receiving from the wider Vex network was now being corrupted by the raw, unfiltered feed of a human mind. She saw the message it had been receiving. It wasn't just a set of orders. It was a priority update. The destruction of the Harvester's data spire had sent a shockwave through the local Vex network. The loss of a Harvester was a significant event, and the collective was retasking all nearby assets. A fleet was being rerouted, a convergence fleet, its destination the source of the anomaly. This ship, they were coming. Not just a few ships, but a force designed to sterilize entire systems. And she was still on board. The warden let out a screech of distorted, grinding metal, a sound of a mind at war with itself. It raised its blade to strike her, but its arm froze mid-swing, locked in a feedback loop of conflicting commands. This was her chance. While it was paralyzed, she focused on a single subsystem she could now see in its internal schematic, the power regulator for its personal shield. It was a simple, elegant piece of code. With a surge of focused will, she sent the command to overload. The warden's chassis began to glow. Filaments of blue light spiderwebbing across its chrome plating. It was a walking bomb. Ilara ripped the scythe free from its leg and threw herself backward, scrambling away as the machine began to convulse. The warden's head snapped towards her, and in its featureless faceplate, she saw a flicker of something that looked almost like surprise before it detonated. The explosion was contained. A dull, concussive whoomp that blew a hole in the deck plating and sent the machine's armored limbs spinning into the void. Ilara lay on the deck, her ears ringing, her body a tapestry of new bruises. The silence that followed was absolute. She had survived. And now, she had a countdown. The Vex were coming. She didn't know how long she had. Hours, maybe a day at most. She had to get to the Whisper scout ship. The path from the cargo bay led into the ship's primary habitation zones, or what passed for them. These were not areas of comfort. They were sterile, white chambers where the ship's biological crew, a species of insectoid beings the Vex had enslaved, were stored in a state of suspended animation between missions. The core breach had caused a catastrophic failure in these sections. The chambers were a grim tableau of death. The life support systems had failed, and the insectoid crew had awoken to a slow, agonizing death by asphyxiation. Their desiccated husks littered the corridors, frozen in postures of silent screaming. It was a graveyard within a graveyard, but something else was moving in the shadows. As Ilara limped through a long, curved hallway, she saw them. Scavengers. They were small, rat-like creatures, not native to the ship, but likely a species that had been captured and had since broken free in the chaos, breeding in the ship's dark, forgotten corners. They were feasting on the dead crew. They were skittish, but also starving. As she passed, a half-dozen of them detached from a corpse and turned towards her, their multifaceted eyes glowing in the dim light, their chittering mandibles clicking hungrily. They saw not a person, but fresh meat, Her plasma cutter was her only defense. She ignited it. The hum and heat a small comfort in the oppressive gloom. The scavengers hesitated, wary of the light and noise. She backed away slowly, keeping the tool between her and them. One of them, bolder than the rest, darted forward. She swung the cutter, and the beam sliced through the creature, cauterizing the wound with a foul hiss. The others scattered, melting back into the darkness. The encounter left her shaken. The ship wasn't just falling apart, it was devolving, its perfect, sterile order giving way to a new, primal ecosystem of decay and predation. She was just another creature trying to survive. Her journey continued, a slow, painful crawl through the ship's dying body. The map in her head was still clear, but the physical reality was a wreck. Corridors were blocked by debris, entire sections exposed to the vacuum. More than once, she had to use the plasma cutter to carve a new path through a buckled bulkhead or a fused door, each use draining the weapon's precious energy reserves. Finally, she reached her destination, the secondary launch bay. It was smaller than the main hangar, designed for a single vessel, and there it was, the Whisper. It was a thing of terrifying beauty, a shard of polished obsidian shaped like a raptor's talon. It rested silently on its launch cradle, untouched by the chaos that had consumed the rest of the ship. This was it, her way out, her hope. The bay controls were on a raised platform overlooking the vessel. As she climbed the ramp, her heart pounded with a mixture of hope and dread. The main power was out, but the emergency systems were still active. The console flickered to life as she approached. She accessed the launch sequence, her fingers flying over the alien interface, the knowledge from the spire guiding her. Launch cradle disengaged, umbilicals retracted, bay doors cycling. A low hum filled the bay as the Whisper began to power up. Below, the massive outer doors began to slide open, revealing the star-dusted blackness of space. And in that blackness, something was waiting. A single Vex ship, a Hunter-class frigate, had just dropped out of hyperspace. It was the vanguard of the Convergence fleet. It hung there, silent and menacing, its weapon ports glowing with nascent energy. It had detected the Harvester's power fluctuations and had come to investigate. Ilara's blood ran cold. The launch sequence was automated. She couldn't stop it. The bay doors were now fully open. The Whisper's engines ignited with a soft, blue glow. It was a lamb being presented for slaughter. The frigate's main cannon began to charge, a ball of incandescent energy gathering at its prow. She had seconds to live. Her mind raced, sifting through the Vex data still echoing in her skull. There was no defense, no weapon she could use, but there was a protocol, a deep-level, rarely used protocol for stealth vessels. The Echidna Protocol. It was a last-ditch defensive measure designed to make a small ship appear as a catastrophic system failure on enemy sensors. It would vent the ship's entire plasma coolant supply in a single, controlled burst, creating a massive, chaotic energy signature that would temporarily blind any nearby Vex ship. It was designed to allow the Whisper to escape under the cover of the confusion. But it had a side effect. Venting the coolant would instantly fry the ship's primary systems, including life support and navigation. It was a suicide maneuver, a way to destroy the ship and its secrets rather than let them be captured. For Ilara, it was her only chance. She didn't have access to the Whisper's internal systems from this console, but she had the cognitive scythe, The launch cradle still had one active data umbilical connected to the ship, feeding it final diagnostic information. It was a thread, a connection. She slammed the scythe onto the console, not caring about the pain, not caring about anything but the single, desperate command she needed to send. The frigate fired, a beam of pure energy, as wide as the whisper itself, shot across the void. At the exact same instant, Alara's command reached the ship. The whisper's hull plating split open in a dozen places, and a massive, blinding cloud of superheated plasma erupted outwards. The frigate's energy beam struck the plasma cloud, not the ship. The resulting explosion was immense. A silent, brilliant starburst that overwhelmed the frigate's sensors. Alarms shrieked across the frigate's bridge as its systems were flash-fried by the unexpected energy feedback. Alara watched from the control platform as the Whisper, now a dead, powerless husk, was sent tumbling end over end into space by the force of the blast. The Echidna protocol had worked. It had saved her from the frigate, but it had also just destroyed her only way off this dying ship. She was trapped, stranded on a derelict, with an entire Vex fleet now on its way to sterilize the area. She slumped against the console, the last of her strength, her last hope. Finally giving out, she was going to die here, in the cold and the dark, at the edge of nowhere. And as the Vex frigate, its systems slowly rebooting, began to turn its attention back to the crippled harvester, she looked down at the scythe in her hand. It was still humming, still connected to the console, and through it, she could feel the whisper. It was dead, yes, but its core databank, shielded against just such an event, was still intact. And inside that databank was a perfect, uncorrupted Vex star chart, a map to the Nexus. The despair was a physical weight, pressing the air from Alara's lungs. Trapped. The word was a final, damning judgment. Outside, the Vex frigate's systems were coming back online. Inside, the Harvester was a collapsing tomb. She had the map, a perfect, glowing chart to the Nexus buried in the dead Whisper's databanks, but it was a map to a heaven she could no longer reach. Her body ached, a symphony of fractures and deep, ragged wounds. It would be so easy to give up, to let the cold and the dark and the Vex take her, to simply end it. But as she stared at the humming console, the cognitive scythe still connecting her to the ghost of the Whisper, a new thought sparked in the ruins of her hope. It was a thought born not of logic or strategy, but of pure, incandescent rage. She was an archivist. She knew that every system, no matter how perfect, has a flaw, a backdoor, a ghost in its machine. And this harvester, this city-sized mausoleum, was now her machine. She had broken its mind, silenced its masters, and walked through its dying veins. She would not escape it. She would wear it. A new plan, terrifying and glorious in its madness, bloomed in her mind. The FTL drive was offline, but the ship's sublight engines, powered by a secondary singularity core, were merely dormant. If she could get to the bridge, to the central command node, she could force them online. She could turn this entire crippled warship into her escape pod. Okay, Lily, she whispered to the locket clutched in her hand, her voice a raw rasp. We're going to fly. The journey to the bridge was a pilgrimage through hell. The ship's structural integrity was failing, creating a treacherous, shifting landscape. Entire decks had collapsed, forcing her to navigate through the tangled guts of the vessel, climbing over massive conduits and crawling through shattered ventilation systems. The nanite swarms were everywhere now, no longer repairing, but consuming, breaking the ship down into its base components in a slow, orderly demolition. They flowed like mercury through the corridors, and she learned to read their patterns, timing her movements to slip through gaps in their patrols. She was no longer just a trespasser, she was a part of the ship's decay. Her blood and the ship's leaking coolant fluids mingled on the floors. Her ragged breathing echoed the groans of stressed metal. The phantom knowledge from the data spire was her only guide, a flickering internal compass pointing her ever forward. After what felt like an eternity, she arrived. The bridge of a Vex harvester was not a place of screens and chairs. It was a cathedral of data. She stood on the threshold of a vast, spherical chamber. In the center, suspended by filaments of faint light, was a throne. It was a single, intricately carved chair made of the same black, crystalline material as the ship's pylons, and it was wired directly into the harvester's primary processing core. This was where the ship's Vex commander, or more likely, its enslaved organic pilot, would sit and become one with the vessel. It was a place of ultimate control and ultimate sacrifice. The chamber was not empty. A low hum emanated from the throne, and the air crackled with residual energy. This was the ship's last bastion of consciousness, its brainstem, still twitching even as the body died around it. To take command, she would have to perform the final, most intimate violation. She would have to sit on the throne. Limping forward, every step in agony, she approached the obsidian chair. As she drew closer, the hum intensified, and the filaments of light connecting it to the core brightened. The ship knew she was here. It was resisting. With the last of her strength, she pulled herself into the seat. The moment she made contact, the scythe, still clutched in her hand, flared to life. It didn't need to bite her. The throne itself was the interface. A torrent of raw, undiluted Vex consciousness slammed into her. This wasn't the filtered data from the spire. This was the ship's own dying thoughts, a nightmare of cold logic, alien agony, and the crushing weight of a collective mind. She felt the ghosts of its enslaved crew, felt the sterilization of 1,000 worlds, felt the cold, empty hunger of the Vex collective. It tried to consume her, to dissolve her identity into its own. But Alara was no longer just Alara. She was a mother who had murdered her daughter's ghost. She was a scholar who had stared into the furnace. She was a pyre of grief and rage, and she would not be consumed. No, she snarled, not with her voice, but with her mind, pushing back with the full force of her humanity. She didn't just fight the ship's consciousness, she infected it. She flooded its logical pathways with her messy, chaotic emotions. She showed it love, showed it loss, showed it the irrational, unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. The Vex mind recoiled, fractured by the illogical assault. The ship shuddered, and a single, coherent thought rose from the chaos, not from the Vex, but from her. Obey. Outside, in the silent void, the harvester's engines began to glow. The Vex frigate, its sensors finally clear, registered the impossible. The derelict was powering up. It fired, a warning shot that stitched a line of fire across the harvester's already wounded hull. Alara felt the impact as a dull, physical blow. Through the ship's external sensors, She saw the frigate, a predator poised to strike. She had no control over the weapon systems. They were too damaged, but she controlled the ship itself. It was a wounded beast, but it was still a beast. She fired the portside maneuvering thrusters, a massive, uncontrolled burn that sent the city-sized ship into a slow, ponderous spin. The frigate, caught off guard by the sudden movement, had to break off its attack run. Ilara was a clumsy pilot, a child at the controls of a dying god, but she was learning. She used the ship's immense mass as a weapon, swinging its shattered prow around like a club. She vented atmosphere from ruptured sections, creating smokescreens of frozen gas. It was a chaotic, ugly fight. The frigate was a scalpel. She was a sledgehammer made of wreckage and spite. The frigate adapted, targeting the engine housings. A direct hit sent a cascade failure through the power relays. Ilara screamed as the feedback surged through the throne. She was losing. But in the ship's dying memories, she found one last weapon. The main cargo bay, the one open to the void, still had its magnetic clamps powered. She spun the ship, presenting the gaping wound to the frigate, and then, focusing all her will, she pulsed the clamps. A storm of debris, the crates she had hidden behind, the shattered remains of the warden. Loose plating was hurled into space. A shotgun blast of shrapnel the size of a city block. The frigate, too close to evade, was shredded. Its shields failed, and the debris tore through its hull, silencing it forever. Victory. But the Harvester was on its last breath. The engines were failing, and the core was moments from total collapse. She had one chance. She delved into the ship's deepest systems, to the Singularity core itself. The data from the Spire had shown her the truth. The Vex powered their most difficult maneuvers by burning souls. And this ship, this ghost ship, still had a full cargo of them, 1,000 consciousnesses from its last harvest, archived and waiting. She was faced with a monstrous choice: to get to the Nexus, to the tiny, flickering chance of saving Lily. She would have to commit the same atrocity as the Vex. She would have to burn 1,000 unknown souls as fuel. The archivist in her recoiled in horror. The mother didn't hesitate. "Forgive me," she whispered to the silent ghosts in the machine, and she gave the command. The ship screamed as the archived souls were fed into the Singularity. Space twisted, bent, and shattered. The jump was not a clean transition. It was a violent, tearing brutalization of space-time. When reality reasserted itself, the Harvester was tumbling, dying, into a new system, and before her, hanging in the abyss, was the Nexus. It was a lattice work of crystalline structures and captured stars, all built around the soul-crushing gravity of a black hole. It was a spider's web the size of a solar system. The Harvester was breaking apart around her. Alarms blared, not just in the ship, but in her own mind. She had minutes, perhaps seconds. She pushed the dying vessel on a collision course with the nearest data hub, a spire that pulsed with the light of 1,000,000,000,000 souls. As the ship began its final, fiery descent, she focused her search, pushing through the Nexus's outer defenses with the last of the Harvester's power. She found the primary archive. She found the manifest from Cygnus X1. She found the data packet labeled Lilith Vance. There was no time to download, no way to contain it, but she had the scythe, and she was the vessel. She reached out with her mind, a mother's hand reaching through a storm of data and light, and she grabbed her daughter's soul. She pulled it from the Vex archive, out of the furnace, and into herself. For a moment, her consciousness was filled with Lily's fear, confusion, and then recognition. Mommy. Alara smiled, tears and blood mixing on her face. I found you, she whispered. She had her daughter. Now, for her final promise. With Lily's presence a warm light in the back of her mind, she gave her last command to the Harvester. She didn't just trigger a self-destruct, she overloaded the Singularity Core, turning the ship and its payload of stolen souls into a bomb of impossible power. As the Harvester plunged into the heart of the Nexus, Elara Vance, archivist and mother, closed her eyes. She felt no fear, only a profound and terrible peace. She had come seeking a single, stolen story. Instead, she had become the cataclysm that wrote the final, silent chapter for a billion others. The universe would never know her name, but it would forever bear the scar of her love. And in the silent, blinding flash that erased the Nexus and its creators from existence, a mother and her child were, at last, reunited.